Yeah, it's not the most uplifting end of this story. I don't know. I'm going to start on a slightly somber note on that. We've had Brexit, lots of things happening in the US in the moment. This is really a saga of kind of American culture. What parallels do you take from this into society now?
I mean, other than everything is terrible and it's always burning.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's hard in that way to sort of compare what's happening here now. There's certainly issues that, are even in the first 3 hours that certainly have to do with American culture, society today. And I think that might be one reason why it's resonating with people, be it the issues of police brutality, domestic violence, celebrity. These two parts are less about the media, which becomes more of a thing in parts 3 and 4 with the trial. But like a lot of the issues that you're sort of seeing in this film are things that we still struggle with every day, and that to see that, it's been this way going back 50 years and how we've dealt with it and sort of this cycle of history. I was very aware that even if we were dealing with history, we're dealing with a story that is very relevant today.
On a personal note, we all know kind of the story of OJ. We think we know the story of OJ. And actually complexities behind it are phenomenal. All the different things of the domestic violence that I think many of us certainly here would have not been as familiar with, kind of the jealousy, but also how big a star he was. But there's really an opportunity for you to ask questions, so let me hand over to the floor first of all.
First of all, just unbelievable. I can't even imagine the torture and misery it must have been to put it together with all of that footage and all of those.
It was so much fun.
Yeah. This is a question about somebody that I read that you did not get, who was Marguerite. I want to know whatever communication you had with her. Tell me was there a chance? Did you meet her? Did you talk to her? How did that whole thing go down?
I mean, there was this whole story, not surprisingly, when we got into it, there was an understanding, even with my knowledge of it before I really got into it, that there are people that I hadn't heard from. And so we had this huge, like these two, I don't even know how to describe them, like canvas boards in our office that probably were a total of 12 feet in length that were just filled with 3x5 cards, note cards, and we'd sort of have names and where they were in the story, and they were all sort of categorized. And there was this, one column that was basically called The Impossibles, and there's 10 names, and it's Marguerite and Al Cowlings and his family, and
Marcus Allen?
Oh yeah, Marcus Allen was on it, but like people that you just knew were never going to be a part of this, even if you would have hoped. And frankly, we probably ended up having contact with almost everyone that we hoped to interview, and even if it's Al Cowlings picking up a phone and hanging up when one of our producers called, it was like, okay, you didn't want to do it. But Marguerite sort of has, more than anyone else, she disappeared, and even during the trial, the prosecution subpoenaed her, and they couldn't find her, and they hired a private investigator to find her, and they found her living in some sort of, she'd moved, dropped off the grid, and they found her living in some random, apartment somewhere in Southern California, and they served her papers, and they wanted her to testify, but they wanted to talk to her. And so literally the point where they subpoenaed her, she came into court, and she walked in that day as if they're calling her to testify, and right when she got to the threshold, they called off the subpoena because they didn't know what she was going to say. It was like this big game of chicken, and so they don't even know what she has to say. And she really, so for us, all we knew is we tried hard. She lives in Northern California. We had no contact with her. So Joe Bell, who is OJ's friend, is in the film, who was, he's great, but he was helpful in trying to find her on our behalf, and said, you try to find her and make contact with her, but like, it was always going to be a lost cause. And, and not only the notion, I don't even know how to describe what that dynamic would be like if suddenly she appeared and she said, sure, I'll do an interview. If she would be forthcoming and talking about this guy who she's known since she was 15 years old and was with him through this rise. You know, it's almost incomprehensible for me to understand what she would offer. But, you know, that also makes me realize how, you know, however much you can strive to gain a level of truth and intimacy in a story, like, how can you really tell a story of a human being when, you know, without the human being and without someone who actually lived beside him this whole time? And I'm very aware of that the representation of OJ in the story, I mean, everything is factually accurate and everything is truthful, but, you know, what the truth is about who he was and what his life was like and the ambitions of his, you know, especially in those years, 67, 68, like, you know, I don't know. You know, we did the best we could, but she would have been, you know, more than anyone else, the person I would have loved to have interviewed, much more than Marcus Allen.
Anyone else?
I mean, it's fantastic filming. I've been really enjoying it. What's the most sort of shocking revelation that you discovered during the whole process? And do you think there's a lot of chapters yet to be played in this story to play out in the future?
I'll answer the second one first. I have no idea. I mean, you know, he's up for parole next year. And so, you know, where you get to this story in the last part, and when you get to sort of the story of why he's in jail, and it's a pretty farcical event, and the sentence that he, you know, was served with is extreme. I wouldn't almost say objectively, but certainly in my opinion, he was sentenced to 33 years in prison for a 4-minute armed robbery of going and stealing back his own memorabilia from people he knew. So it was a little random. And so, you know, whatever the karmic justice that comes with that, it's not justice. And so he's been in jail already for 8-9 years, and so he's up for parole, and he might get it. What his life will be like and what he has to say about anything when he comes out of jail, I have no idea. It stands to reason that I'm sure he's going to want to make some money, and I'm sure there's a payday for him, and I'm sure he's going to want to talk about it. You know, having said that, there's also, you know, there's a 6-hour documentary that's being executive produced by Martin Sheen that's coming out next year, trying to prove that OJ is innocent based on a book that was written by a private investigator from Texas who claims he spent 17 years investigating this crime, and his theory is that his son did it. Whatever. You know, so, you know, it's proven that this case and this story is not going to go away. But to say what it's going to, like, where it's going to end up next, I you know, I don't know. As far as the most I don't know. I mean, honestly, there was nothing that was overly shocking. I think you'd find that a lot of the stuff, and you know, maybe this not to cut what we did or denigrate what we did, you know, because we worked really hard and did a lot of work. But, you know, as far as revelations, you know, I don't know that this wasn't, you know, it was investigative in the sense you try to find all this out and you try to cohere it in a way that makes sense, and it's a huge story, and you try to intercut and interweave these two huge stories. But a lot of it is reported. A lot of it is on the record in some form if you actually look and, you know, do your homework. And so I don't know that there are many facts that had not existed before. So before I ever went and shot a frame and did any interviews, I knew a lot. And so there was very few things that, you know, it's like, oh, so I knew OJ's dad was gay because I read it somewhere. Now, do I know that anyone's going to talk to me about it? That anyone's going to acknowledge it? I have no idea. But, like, the second interview I did was with his friend Calvin Tennyson, and it's like you get to a point where you're about to ask about his dad, and and he just sort of volunteers the story, and you're like, oh, okay, well, this is just a known fact to people around him at this time. And so there are little moments like that happen throughout the course of, you know, the process. But as far as these major revelations, yeah, I don't, nothing that was overly shocking or more shocking than anything else.
How long was that research period before you picked up a camera? And structurally, how clear was it in your head, again, before you started shooting anything?
So, you know, it's been sort of about a 2-year process total. I was approached, like, sort of the first conversation I had about it was, say, February of 2014. I probably started when I knew in fact was doing this was, say, May, and I spent that summer 2 years ago just reading everything I could, reading and thinking and doing, and so that was probably a 4-month period or 4 to 5 month period before we ever shot anything, and that was 3 or 4 months of me by myself before I even hired anybody to figure out what I was going to do. So that was that, and so it was a very intense 1.5 year period to actually do the film, and that's not that much time for doing something that's as long as it is, from when we hired and started shooting and putting together. But as far as the sort of structure of it, there are certain things that I came in with a basic knowledge of. I understood who OJ was when he went to USC. I understood where he'd come from, what USC was like, where it was located geographically, next to Watts. I understood the timing, of when he got there versus what had happened a 1.5 years before. I understood there was this movement of black athletes. There's certain things that I already understood, and it was actually those are the things that made me interested in doing the film, because I didn't really want to do it. Because essentially when someone came to me and said, hey, do you want to do this 5-hour film about OJ, which it was initially, that was the conceit, the answer is like no, because what else is there to say? But at least from what I thought about it and when I started reading more about it, was like, well, I could explore all these things that I am interested in. I can explore the city, I can explore the history of the LAPD, the black migration, I understood, OJ's racial identity in terms of the way people think about him. And so the idea that I could get into that while there's this concurrent story and explore those two things, that kind of came to me pretty quickly. And that was actually what thrust me into doing it, because I think without some sort of sense that this is even something that I don't want to live in for a while, I wouldn't have gotten there if it was do the trial and, do the murder. Which, while we do it thoroughly, it's not like the question of did he do it, did he not do it, and all those things never interested me at all.
You mentioned going back to sort of Watts riots and migration. Were there any strands that you were desperate to explore that you couldn't just fit into the actual sort of base animal?
Strands, no. I mean, there are things here and there about like OJ and that you hear about or heard about, that I would have loved to have put in, like, so since you guys just watched part 2, and part of his life in Southern California was, that's germane to the story. OJ is someone who reputedly was a pretty regular cocaine user, and even people wonder how much that played a role ultimately in the the events of that night, even though there was no drugs found in his body, and how much of a role that played, even going back to his days when he played football. And there's a guy whose name that we wanted to interview who ran this big club and was a friend of OJ's in Buffalo, and then you hear like, oh, he was OJ's cocaine dealer. He doesn't really want to talk about this, and so you hear a couple stories here and there, but nothing that's substantiated enough and narratively relevant enough for me to include beyond someone saying. So it's like, if you can't then piece something together in a meaningful way, then you ultimately can't put it in. I mean, that's one thing that jumps off the top of my head. I mean, there are probably things here and there that, and I mean, here's the thing, there's a kind of an omnivorous approach informationally to what you're trying to get when you're doing all these interviews. And so I'm sure if I could have found, an interesting story about OJ's decision to end his, being in Roots, in terms of who he was and why he chose that, and why that, like, I would have loved to put in. So there are things all over the map that, like, I would love to include, but you sort of try your best to get all of these things and see what ends up being relevant to the narrative you're trying to tell. And I'm sure there are more. My brain's a little fried, so those are two.